Welcome to Grandpa Explains. Come in. Settle yourself down, wherever you are tonight. Pull the blanket up a little higher, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, and let the day you just finished begin to loosen its grip on you. There is nothing you need to do now. Nothing to solve, nothing to hold on to, nowhere else you have to be. Just here, just this quiet, just the sound of an old voice telling you a story until you drift off. And tonight the story is about a man who spent his whole life staring into the dark. Not the dark of a bedroom like yours, the dark inside a person, the part of the mind that stays hidden, even from the one who owns it. Let me set the scene for you, slowly, because it is worth seeing. There is a room in the city of Vienna on a street called Berggasse at number 19. A quiet apartment up a flight of stairs in a tall grey building like 100 others on that street. And in that room, for most of a lifetime, there was a couch. Not a couch for sitting the way you might imagine. It was a divan, a long, low sort of daybed, and it was draped with a Persian rug. One of those thick woven carpets with deep reds and patterns that seem to fold in on themselves the longer you look. There were cushions piled at one end. And people came to that room day after day, year after year, and they lay down upon that rug-covered couch, and they closed their eyes, or they stared up at the ceiling, and they began to talk. But here is the strange rule of that room, the one small detail that tells you almost everything about the man. When you lay on that couch, you could not see the doctor. He sat behind you, just behind your head, out of your line of sight, in a chair of his own, and you would talk and talk into the air of the room while he listened, unseen. You would never once, through the whole long hour, look him in the eye. Now, why would a man arrange his work like that? You would think a doctor would want to face his patient, to read the face, to nod and lean in. But not this one. He said quite plainly that he could not bear to be stared at for 8 hours a day. Imagine that. A man who made his living listening to the most private thoughts a person can have, who wanted those thoughts poured out to him hour after hour, and yet could not stand to be looked at while he received them. So he sat behind, hidden, a voice in the room, and a pair of ears, and very little else that the patient could see. The man's name was Sigmund Freud. And that little arrangement of the couch, the patient laid bare and the doctor tucked out of sight, is a picture I want you to carry with you as you fall asleep, because it holds the whole shape of his life inside it. Because you see, Freud believed something that unsettled the whole world when he said it. He believed that most of what goes on inside a human being is hidden, not just from other people, hidden from you, hidden from the very person doing the thinking. He believed the mind keeps most of itself in the dark, behind a curtain, in a back room you are not allowed to enter, and that all the things you feel and do and blurt out and dream at night come drifting up from that hidden place like smoke from a fire you cannot see. He gave that hidden place a name. He called it the unconscious. And the whole of his long, strange, stubborn life was one attempt to open the door to that back room and shine a lamp inside. And here is the part that makes the story worth telling, the part I want to slip into your ear before anything else. Because plenty of men study a mystery from a safe distance. They put on the white coat, they hold the thing at arm's length. They measure it and write it down and go home to their supper untouched. Freud did not do that. When Freud wanted to understand the hidden mind, he did not begin with a stranger. He began with himself, his own grief, his own bad habits, his own dreams, night after night, written down in the morning and pulled apart like a watch on a workbench. his own failures, and there were real ones, his own dying body, at the end. He took the one mind he could truly get inside, which was his own, and he turned it inside out to see what was in there. He did not observe the unconscious across a room. He dug it out of himself. Remember that as we go. The man who told the world that the mind hides most of itself from itself spent every year he had turning his own hidden things into tools. Now let me take you back into that study at Burgas 19, because there is more to see there, and it is the sort of room you could get lost in. Picture the desk, and picture, crowded all across that desk and along the shelves and on every surface that would hold them, little statues, figurines, small ancient gods and goddesses and kings made of stone and bronze and clay, gathered from Egypt and Greece and Rome and China. Not 2 or 3 of them, mind you, more than 2,000. 2,000 little figures, thousands of years old, packed shoulder to shoulder like a silent crowd, watching over everything he wrote. He loved them the way another man might love his garden. He would keep a favourite one right in front of him while he worked, set it there on the blotter like a small companion, and turn it over in his fingers while he thought. Some mornings, they say, he would greet a certain statuette before he sat down, the way you might say good morning to a cat. And these were not just decoration, they were the picture of how he thought about his own work. Because Freud said that what he did, this business of listening and questioning and following a patient's talk back through the years, was a kind of digging. He compared himself to an archaeologist. You know the sort, the ones who go out to some old ruined city buried under the sand, and they take their little brushes and their trowels, and they scrape away the dirt, one careful layer at a time, going down and down through the centuries until they find the broken pieces of a life that was covered over long ago. That, Freud said, is what happens inside a person too. The old feelings, the old wounds, the frightening things from childhood, none of them ever truly get thrown away. They get buried, covered over by newer years, packed down under the ordinary business of growing up, until you forget they are even down there. And the work, the talking cure, was the slow, careful digging that brought them back up into the light. So, of course, he filled his room with ancient things pulled up out of the ground. They were, in a way, a picture of his own trade. He excavated people. He excavated himself. And the little stone gods watched him do it. There, sit in that room a moment longer. The lamp low, the smell of cigar smoke, which we will come to, hanging in the air, the couch with its Persian rug, waiting for the next patient. The old gods on the desk. That is the workshop of the man. Now let us go back to the beginning of him, all the way back, and see how a person even arrives at a room like that. He was born a long way from Vienna, in a small town, on the 6th of May in the year 1856. The town was called Freiberg, in a region called Moravia, which in those days belonged to the great sprawling Austrian Empire. If you went looking for it today, you would find it under a different name, Bor, in what is now the Czech Republic. A modest place, the kind of small town where everyone knows the shape of everyone else's day. And he was not born with the name the world would come to know. On the day he arrived, he was written down in the register as Sigmund Shlomo Freud. Sigismund, it was only later, when he was a young man at university, around the age of 21 or so, that he trimmed it down to the shorter, cleaner Sigmund, the name that would end up in every textbook and on every couch cartoon for a century after. But at the start, a baby named Sigismund Shlomo, in a wool merchant's household in a small Moravian town. The father was called Jacob, Jacob Freud, a merchant who dealt in wool, a man already getting on in years by the time this particular son was born, around 40 years old, and already on his third marriage. Life was not gentle in those days, and men often buried wives and married again. The mother was a different matter altogether. Her name was Amalia Nathanson, and she was young, some 20 years younger than her husband. Sigmund was her firstborn, her first child, and by every account she adored him with a fierce and open love. She called him her golden Siggy, her golden one, and there is a saying that hung around him his whole life afterward. The idea that a boy who has been the absolute favourite of his mother carries something unshakable in him for the rest of his days, a kind of conqueror's confidence, a settled certainty that he is meant for great things. Whether she said those exact words or not, the feeling was real, and it was in him. He walked through a difficult world as a man who had been, from his first breath, somebody's golden child. The family was Jewish, though not in a strict or church-going way, if you will forgive the loose use of the word. Largely secular, they would say now. Freud himself, when he was grown, called himself a godless Jew, and he meant both halves of it. Godless, because he did not believe in the God of the prayers, and he never pretended to. He had no faith of that kind, none at all, and he was honest about it his whole life. But a Jew all the same, and he never once tried to slip out of that. His people, his history, his sense of himself as an outsider in a city that was not always kind to Jews, all of that he kept and even guarded. A godless Jew. A man with no religion who would not for anything give up his belonging. Hold that too. Because that outsider's place, standing a little apart from the respectable crowd, is part of how he found the nerve to say the unrespectable things he ended up saying. Money, though. Money was the trouble that moved them. The wool trade in that small town went sour, the way trades do, and the family had to pack up and go looking for a better living. First to Leipzig for a spell, and then, around the years 1859 and 60, when little Sigmund was just 3 or 4 years old, on to the great city of Vienna. And there, in Vienna, he stayed. Not for a year or a decade, for nearly 80 years. Almost his entire life, from a small boy to a dying old man, would be spent inside that one city. Until the very end, when the world itself came and drove him out. But we are a long way from that yet. For now, just a merchant's family, a little short of money, arriving in the big city with a bright-eyed, much-loved boy at the centre of it. And there was something tangled in that family that Freud himself later pointed to, when he tried to understand where his lifelong fascination with families came from. It was an odd knot of relations. His father, being an older man on his third marriage, already had grown sons from before. Sons who were themselves older than the young mother, Amalia. Think about that for a moment as you lie there. His half-brothers were men older than his own mother. And there was a nephew, a boy called John, who was actually the same age as little Sigmund himself, a playmate, the same size, and yet by the family tree this boy was his nephew, somehow beneath him in the order of things. It made a child's head spin. Who is really the elder here? Who comes before whom? Who is the parent, and who is the child? Freud said, later on, that this early tangle, this puzzle of who stood where in the family, fed his lifelong interest in the dramas that play out between parents and children, husbands and wives, brothers and rivals. The seed was planted young in his own crowded, confusing household. So the boy grew. And he grew, as you might guess of a golden child, into a formidable student. Sharp, hungry, hard-working, the kind of young man who reads everything he can lay his hands on and remembers most of it. When the time came to choose a path, he went into medicine. In the year 1873, at the age of 17, he entered the University of Vienna to study to become a doctor. But here is a thing that surprises people, and it is one of the first real turns in the story, so let me slow down and lay it out plainly. The Sigmund Freud that the world remembers is a man of the mind, dreams, feelings, hidden desires, the whole invisible country of the soul. You would think, then, that he began there, that from the very start he was fascinated by emotions and secrets. But he did not begin there at all. The young Freud was not a dreamer poking at feelings. He was a hard-nosed scientist of the body, a man of the laboratory bench, with a microscope and a scalpel and a great deal of patience. Before he ever mapped the psyche, he cut up eels. Let me tell you about that, because it is a lovely picture of the young man, and it tells you what kind of mind he had before he turned it toward the invisible. He fell in at the university with a professor named Ernst Brücke. Now, Brücke was a serious man, a physiologist, which is to say a scientist of how the living body actually works, and he held a view of the world that was as hard and clear as a pane of glass. Brücke believed and taught that there is nothing mysterious going on inside a living creature. No magic spark, no special life force, no soul stuff floating about making things happen. He believed that everything in the body, everything, is the working of ordinary physical and chemical forces. The same forces that move a river or heat a kettle or rust a nail. Push and pull, energy and matter, cause and effect, and not one thing more. A mechanical world, all the way down. That was Brücke's faith, if a godless man may be said to have a faith, and the young Freud drank it in. And here is the thing to hold on to, because it never fully left him. Even years and years later, when Freud had turned away from the microscope and toward the strangest, most invisible thing there is, the human mind, he still carried Brücke's hard world inside him. He still, deep down, believed that the mind must work by forces too, by pressures and drives and energies pushing against one another, like steam building up in a boiler, like water seeking its level. When you hear Freud later talk about desires being pushed down and building up pressure until they burst out sideways, that is Brücke's mechanical world, only now the machine is not the body but the soul. He never quite stopped being the physicist's pupil, even when he became the poet of the unconscious. The old materialist teacher left his fingerprints on everything. But first, the bench, the patient, quiet, sometimes tedious work of real science. And what work it was! The young Freud in Brücke's laboratory set himself to one of those small, stubborn puzzles that fill the early years of a scientist's life. He went looking for something that nobody had been able to find. He wanted to know how eels reproduce. It sounds like a joke, I know, lying there half asleep, an old story about a young man and a great pile of eels. But it was a genuine mystery of the day. Nobody had properly located the male reproductive organs of the eel. They were elusive, hidden, hard to pin down, and Freud, ever the digger, decided he would find them. So he dissected eels. Not one or two. Hundreds of them, slippery, cold, silver things, one after another, laid open under his blade and studied under the lens, hour after hour, day after day, his fingers, no doubt raw and stinking of the fishmongers, hunting through the guts of these creatures for a thing so small and so well hidden that it had defeated everyone before him. Hundreds of eels. Picture the patience of it, the sheer bloody-minded stubbornness of a young man who will cut open his 300th eel because the answer might be in that one. That is the same stubbornness, you understand, that would later have him digging through his own dreams for years on end. The eel and the dream, the same trait, only pointed in different directions. And he did not stop at eels. He studied the nervous systems of humbler creatures too, the nerve cells of the crayfish, those little freshwater lobsters, peering at the fine threadwork of their nerves under the microscope. And in doing that, in tracing how the tiny nerve cells connected, or nearly connected, one to another, he brushed up against ideas that the science of the brain would only fully understand later, the whole question of how the individual nerve cell is the basic unit of the nervous system. He was, in these years, a real and gifted brain scientist, a histologist they call it, one who studies the tissues of the body under the lens, tissue so thin the light shines through it. Freud, the neuroscientist, Freud with the microscope, Freud counting nerve cells and dissecting eels in the lamplight of Ernst Brücke's laboratory. That was the young man. Not a word yet about mothers or dreams or the hidden self, just a careful, patient, ambitious scientist of the physical body, learning to look very hard at very small things and to trust only what he could actually find. He took his time at his studies too. He entered the medical school in 1873, as I said, but he did not take his medical degree, his doctorate, until 1881. 8 years. A slow track for a bright man, and the reason is telling. He kept getting caught up in the research. The pure science, the eels and the nerve cells, the questions with no bedside and no patient attached, interested him far more than the ordinary business of learning to treat coughs and fevers and set broken bones. Given the choice between the laboratory and the ward, the young Freud drifted again and again toward the laboratory. He wanted to know how things worked far more than he wanted to make a living curing them. It was only slowly, and partly because a poor man cannot dissect eels forever and must eventually earn his bread, that he came round to the practical matter of becoming a working doctor. But you can see already, can't you, the shape of the man forming, the stubbornness, the patience with a hidden thing, the willingness to spend years, actual years, on a single buried question that everyone else had given up on. The materialist's faith that under the mystery there is a mechanism, if only you dig deep enough and look hard enough. The outsider's nerve. And underneath all of it, warming it, that golden confidence his mother poured into him in the cradle. The unshakable sense that he, Sigmund Freud, was going to find something no one else had found. He did not yet know it would not be in an eel. He did not yet know that the buried thing he would spend his life excavating was not in the guts of a fish or the nerves of a crayfish, but in the back room of every human head, his own included. He was still at the bench, still with the microscope, still a young man in a laboratory in Vienna with fish-stained hands and a head full of Brücke's clean mechanical world. The couch with its Persian rug was years away. The 2,000 little gods were not yet gathered. The word unconscious was not yet the word that would follow his name down through the century. But the tools were being forged, all the same, in those quiet laboratory years. The patience to sit with a thing that will not give up its secret. The habit of looking where others had stopped looking. The trust in cause and effect, in pressure and force, in the idea that nothing in a living creature happens for no reason at all. He would carry every bit of that out of Brücke's laboratory and into the strange new country he was about to enter. because something was coming that would turn this careful bench scientist, this dissector of eels, off his safe and respectable path and set him on the road toward the hidden mind. It began, of all things, with a white powder that he thought would make his name, and nearly did, though not at all in the way he hoped. But that, my dears, is where the trouble begins, and the trouble deserves the fresh part of the night. For now, just hold the picture. The young man in the lamplit laboratory, the eels laid open on the bench, the old mechanical world of his teacher humming in his head. And somewhere ahead of him, still unseen, a couch, a room full of ancient gods, and the long dark country of the mind, waiting to be dug open, one careful layer at a time. Notice how quiet the laboratory is when you really settle into it. No hurry there, no crowd, just the long window going grey with evening, and a young man who forgets to eat because he has found something under the glass that he does not yet understand. Hold that. There is no rush tonight, and there was no rush in him either, not for the work. He could sit with one small mystery for a very long time. And the mystery, in those years, was an eel. Of all the humble creatures to bend a great mind, it was the eel. You see, for a very long time, no one could say how eels made more eels. No one had ever found the parts that ought to do it. Wise old naturalists had argued about this for centuries, and still the eel kept its secret folded away somewhere no knife had reached. So they handed the young Freud a knife and a pile of them and told him to look. And look he did, hundreds of them. One after another opened on the bench, searched, set aside. Hundreds. Try to imagine the patience in that, the sheer unglamorous patience of a man leaning over slippery little bodies day after day, hunting for something that might not even be there to find. He did not find it, in the end. But he did not learn nothing. He learned how to wait on a thing that does not want to be seen. He learned that a secret can sit in plain sight for 1,000 years and still keep itself, and that the only way in is slow, careful, one layer beneath the last. Remember that lesson. It is the whole of him, really, learnt first on a fish, and when he was done with the eels, there were the crayfish. He took their nerve cells and set them under the microscope and drew what he saw, the fine threads of them, the little branching shapes that carry a signal through a living thing. He was, in those days, a man mapping the wiring of small animals. Not the soul, not the dream, the wiring. He was very close, closer than he knew, to ideas about how the cells of a nervous system talk to one another that others would later carry the rest of the way. He was a proper scientist of the body, with fish-stained hands and a careful pencil, and if you had stopped him on the street and told him that one day the whole world would say his name when it meant the hidden mind, he would have thought you had lost your senses. He was looking at nerves. He was not looking at ghosts. The man who taught him to look that way was Ernst Brücke, and Brücke believed something hard and clean, and for its time, almost defiant. He believed that inside a living creature there are no special forces, no secret spark of life breathed in from somewhere else. Nothing magical humming beneath the skin, only the same forces that move the rest of the world. Push and pull. Pressure, chemistry, the plain machinery of cause and effect, running in a body the same as it runs in a river or a stone. That was the creed of that laboratory, and the young Freud drank it down and never quite spat it out. All his life, even when he had wandered off into the strangest country a doctor ever entered, some part of him still stood in Brücke's cold, clean room, insisting that nothing happens for no reason, that every effect has a cause pressing behind it, even when the cause is buried too deep to see. He would take that iron rule and turn it upon the mind. He would say, in effect, that a slip of the tongue is not an accident, that a forgotten name is not an accident, that a dream is not nonsense the sleeping head throws off at random. Everything has a cause. He learned to believe that here, over the crayfish, long before he ever sat behind a couch. Take a slow, deep breath now, if you would. Let the eels and the microscope and the grey window settle into the dark behind your eyes. There is nothing you need to hold on to. When you are ready, we will go on together. Because here is the thing worth knowing about that patient young man at the bench. The tools of his whole strange life were being cut and sharpened in those quiet years, and he could not have told you what he was making them for. The waiting he learned on the eels, the trust in hidden causes he learned from Brücke. And a third thing, older than either, that he carried in from before the laboratory doors ever opened to him. It was a certain unshakable steadiness in himself, a quiet certainty that he was meant to do something large. His mother had planted that in him early, this firstborn son she loved past all sense, her golden boy, treated in that crowded household as though the sun rose and set on him alone. A child loved like that, so the old saying goes, carries a conqueror's confidence for the rest of his days. And he did. He would need every ounce of it, because the country he was walking toward would have him laughed at, called mad, called obscene, called a fraud, for years and years before anyone bowed their head and listened. And he walked toward it, in the end, as a kind of outsider, which perhaps made the walking easier. He was a Jew in a city that did not always want him, and he was, by his own cheerful admission, a godless one. A man with no faith in the old comforts, no heaven to fall back on. He would not be looking upward for his answers. He would be looking inward and downward into the dark cellar of a person where the ordinary daylight does not reach. Think of the room he would one day build for that work. A study crammed so full of little ancient gods and figurines that a visitor hardly knew where to rest his eyes. 2,000 of them, near enough, gathered over a lifetime. Small stone Egyptians and Greeks and Romans crowding his desk, standing sentry while he wrote. One favourite set right before him like a companion. And he would say, this man who had once dug through fish for a secret they would not give up, that his new work was a kind of digging too. An archaeology of the mind, he called it. You brush away the surface, the loose everyday dirt of it, and beneath there is an older layer, and beneath that an older one still, and you go down carefully, level by level, into what a person has buried and forgotten they buried. The little gods on his desk had been dug out of the ground, and he sat among them, planning to dig out of people the things they had hidden even from themselves. But before any of that, before the couch and the gods and the whole long strange descent, there was the white powder and the terrible bright hope he pinned to it. It was 1884, and he was 28 years old, and he was in a hurry. That is the thing about Freud that the statues and the legends tend to leave out. By the time the world knew his name, he was old and ill, and settled into the gravity of a great man. But in 1884 he was young, and he was broke, and he was worried. He had been a student for 8 years. He had his medical degree now, the paper with his name on it, but a degree was not a salary, and a salary was the thing he needed if he was ever going to marry Martha Bernays and set up a household and be, at last, the thing he wanted to be, established, respectable, a man with a place in the world. He needed a discovery, not just some careful contribution to the literature on crayfish nerve cells, something the world would actually notice. And then he read about cocaine. The substance had been known in Europe for some years, brought back from South America, extracted from the coca leaf. Soldiers in Peru had chewed the leaf for centuries to dull fatigue and hunger at altitude. A German army surgeon had studied its effects and published findings that suggested it could restore tired muscles and lift a man's mood. Freud read those findings with the focused attention of someone who already suspects he has found what he was looking for. He ordered a supply. He took it himself. And what he felt was unmistakable. Energy returned from wherever it had gone. A sharpening, a warmth that was not feverish but clear. He worked longer. He ate less and seemed not to mind. He wrote to Martha, his fiancée, about what this substance could do, and the letters have a brightness to them that is easy to recognize. That particular brightness of a person who has discovered something and cannot quite believe their luck. He called the paper he wrote Coca. On Coca, published in 1884. He described the effects on mood and energy and physical endurance in terms that were, looking back, enthusiastic to the point of recklessness. He sent the paper out, and he sent some of the cocaine itself to Martha to try, to see what she thought. He was happy about it. He was genuinely happy. Now, here is the first of the rooms where things went wrong. He had a friend. His name was Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow, and he was a scientist at the Physiology Institute, where Freud had trained under Brücke, the great materialist. He was brilliant, and he was in pain. He had accidentally infected his hand during a dissection years earlier and had lost the hand to it, and the pain from the healing nerves had never fully left him, and to manage that pain he had been given morphine. And morphine, as anyone who has watched a person be given morphine for long enough will tell you, does not release you easily. Fleischl-Marxow had become dependent on it, the way the body wraps itself around a substance until it cannot imagine being without it. Freud believed he had found the answer. He told his friend about cocaine. He believed, genuinely believed, that the cocaine would wean Fleischl-Marxow away from the morphine, that you could trade one substance for the other and then step down from the lesser one without the same terrible cost. This was not a cynical idea. It was a caring one, offered by a man who had read what little was written and felt the substance's effects himself and trusted what he felt. It did not work. What it did was far worse. Fleischl-Marxow did not trade the morphine for the cocaine and then walk free. He took both, and then more cocaine, and then more, in quantities far beyond what Freud had imagined, and the cocaine opened in him something frightening, a dependency far more acute and far stranger than the morphine had been. He became one of the first documented cases of severe cocaine addiction. He suffered what are called cocaine psychoses. He suffered agonies. He suffered for years. Freud watched all of this. He visited. He sat with his friend through terrible nights. He wrote about those nights later, the anguish of watching someone you admire be dismantled by a thing you had pressed into his hands with the best intentions in the world. It was a wound. It left a mark. And it was not the only thing lost to the white powder. Because here is the other thing. While Freud was studying cocaine's effects on mood and energy, he noticed that when the substance touched the tongue, it produced a curious numbness, a local dulling of sensation. He noted it. He did not pursue it. He was not thinking about surgery. He was thinking about mood, about energy, about the mind. His colleague Karl Koller was thinking about the eye. Koller was an ophthalmologist, a surgeon of eyes, and he had a problem that every eye surgeon of the era had, There was no way to numb the eye for an operation without putting the patient fully under. The eye is not a place you can operate on with a patient who is thrashing or blinking. It was a tremendous limitation. Koller had been quietly looking for a solution. When he heard what Freud had noted about cocaine and the tongue, he tried it on the eye. He put cocaine solution into a patient's eye. The eye went numb. Not the patient, just the eye, just the surface, local and precise and controlled. In 1884, the year Freud published Brücke, Karl Koller announced at a medical conference that cocaine was an effective local anesthetic for ophthalmic surgery. The first effective local anesthetic in ophthalmology. The one that opened the door to an entire field of surgical technique. The discovery that changes how surgery is done forever. Freud had been standing in the doorway. He had held the key in his hand, noted the lock it might open, and walked on. And Koller walked back, tried the door, and the door swung wide. He spoke about this later, Freud did. He acknowledged it plainly. He had been the one to look at cocaine, and the anesthetic discovery had slipped through his fingers because he had been in a hurry to get to Martha, to get home, and had not stayed long enough to follow the thread where it led. Some failures teach you facts. Some failures teach you something about your own nature. This one may have taught him that the most important things tend to hide just past the point where you stopped looking. Take a slow breath now. Let that settle a moment. He continued to use cocaine himself, intermittently, for years after it appears, from what the record shows, that he stopped sometime in the mid-1890s. But what the cocaine episode gave him, beyond the wounds, was a kind of practical education in the limits of matter. You can put a substance in a body and watch what happens. And what happens will often surprise you, and the surprise will not always be gentle. The body does not always do what the theory says it should. He was 30 years old, and he was beginning to think about the things the body does that the theory cannot account for. Which is perhaps why, in 1885, he applied for a travelling fellowship that would take him to Paris, and why, when he got there, he found the thing that would change the direction of his whole life. The hospital was called the Salpêtrière. It was an enormous place on the left bank of the Seine, a kind of city within a city, and it had been for a long time a place where the poor and the incurable and the mad were gathered together, warehoused, cared for in their various degrees of suffering. By 1885 it had also become, under one particular doctor, something close to a theatre. His name was Jean-Martin Charcot. Charcot was already a legend. He had spent decades studying the nervous system and had described and named diseases with a precision that made him one of the most respected neurologists alive. When he walked into a room, the room arranged itself around him. He had the quality of a man who does not raise his voice because he has never needed to. And on certain days, in a large lecture hall at the Salpêtrière, he put patients on a stage and hypnotized them. The patients were women, most of them, and they had been admitted with a diagnosis that was applied, in that era, to a very wide and somewhat shapeless set of symptoms. Paralysis that came and went, blindness that had no visible cause, fits that looked like epilepsy but were not. Limbs that would not move for reasons no anatomist could find when he looked. The word for all of this was hysteria, from the Greek word for womb, because the assumption, for a very long time, had been that this was something that happened only to women, and that the cause lay somewhere in the body's female architecture. Charcot did not believe this. Not exactly. What Charcot believed, or was moving toward believing, was something more radical and more strange. He believed that some of these paralyses, some of these symptoms with no physical lesion behind them, were produced not by damage to the body, but by something happening in the mind. Under hypnosis, he could remove the symptoms, and under hypnosis, he could produce them. He could tell a hypnotized patient that her arm was paralyzed, and the arm would go limp, and no amount of effort would move it. And when you examined the arm, there was nothing physically wrong with it. And then he could tell her it was fine, and it would move again. Freud stood in those lectures and felt something shift. He had been trained by Brücke, who believed that only physical and chemical forces act in the organism. The brain was a mechanism. The nerves were wires. If something was wrong with the body, the fault lay in the tissue, in the chemistry, in the structure you could examine with your hands or your instruments. That was the modern scientific view. That was what it meant to be rigorous. But here was Charcot, the most rigorous neurologist in Europe, showing an audience that a word could paralyze an arm. Not a disease, not a lesion. A word, given under hypnosis, could stop a limb from moving. What does that mean? It means the mind can make the body sick. It means there is some channel between what a person thinks and fears and buries and what happens in the flesh. It means that if you want to understand certain kinds of suffering, you cannot only look at the body. You have to look somewhere else. Freud stayed in Paris for nearly 5 months. He translated Charcot's lectures into German and sent the translations home. He took notes. He watched the demonstrations again and again. And when he left, he carried the idea with him, the way you carry something that has not yet finished changing you. He named his first son Jean-Martin after the man. That is a small thing to mention, perhaps, but it is the kind of small thing that tells you how deeply a person has been marked. You do not name a child after someone who merely taught you a skill. You name a child after someone who remade the angle at which you stand. Quick reminder, after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. He came back to Vienna in 1886 and set up a practice. He was going to treat patients with nervous complaints. And in September of that same year, after an engagement that had lasted 4 years and had been conducted almost entirely by post, nearly 900 letters, back and forth, Sigmund and Martha, across the distance between Vienna and the various places she lived, they were married. Think about those 900 letters for a moment. 900. That is not correspondence. That is a relationship conducted in language, in the daily work of putting into words what you feel and what you want and what you fear and what you hope. He was writing himself out, every day, to the woman he loved. He was learning that the sentence, the written sentence, the spoken sentence, could carry something real. He may not have known yet what use he would make of that lesson. Martha Bernays became Martha Freud, and between 1887 and 1895 she gave birth to 6 children. Mathilde, then Jean-Martin, then Oliver, then Ernst, then Sophie, and then, in 1895, the youngest, Anna, 6 children in 8 years. The apartment at Berggasse 19 in Vienna, which Freud had taken on in 1891, filled with the sound and movement of a large family. There were patients in one room and children in another, and the smell of tobacco already beginning to settle into the curtains and the books. He was a father. He was a clinician. He was working. And he was watching something in his consulting room that he could not quite explain. The women who came to him, And it was often women, in that era, with those kinds of symptoms, sometimes got better when they talked. Not when he did anything to them, not when he gave them medication or examined them or applied the electrical treatments that were fashionable at the time. When they talked. When something in the talking reached some corner of the trouble and eased it. He had seen Charcot use hypnosis to move symptoms in and out of the body. He had watched that and believed it. But hypnosis required a particular susceptibility that not all patients had, and it felt, to him, like borrowing something, imposing a state rather than helping a person find their own way through. He was looking for something else. He found it, or the first sketch of it, through the work of Josef Breuer. Breuer was older than Freud, a physician of considerable reputation in Vienna, a man with the kind of settled, respected place in the medical community that Freud was still trying to build. He had been kind to Freud in the hard early years, had lent him money, had offered advice and friendship. He was also, Freud would come to understand, sitting on something remarkable. Several years earlier, this would have been in the early 1880s, before Freud went to Paris, Breuer had been treating a young woman. She was 21, the daughter of a respectable Viennese family, intelligent and imaginative in ways that her circumstances gave no outlet for. When her father fell gravely ill and she nursed him through his long dying, she began to develop symptoms that none of Breuer's examinations could account for. A paralysis of her right arm, temporary blindness, difficulty with language, she would lose German entirely for stretches and speak only in English. A cough, a squint, absences, trances in which she seemed to be somewhere else entirely. Breuer treated her over a period of months, visiting her most days, and what he found, almost by accident, was that when she talked, when she described in complete detail the circumstances in which a particular symptom had first appeared, the symptom sometimes eased or disappeared. Not always, not completely, but with a regularity that was too consistent to dismiss. She herself understood that something was happening in the talking. She was a precise, thoughtful woman, despite her illness, and she had her own words for what she and Breuer were doing together. She called it the talking cure. That is her phrase, not Breuer's, not Freud's. The patient named it. She also called it, with a kind of dry humour that the suffering did not quite extinguish. Chimney sweeping, as though she were clearing something blocked, as though the words were a brush going down into a dark flue and bringing up what had accumulated in the soot. Her real name was Bertha Pappenheim. The case history that Freud and Breuer would eventually publish gave her the pseudonym Anna O. And under that pseudonym, Anna O., she became one of the most discussed patients in the history of medicine. Her real self invisible behind the initial, her actual name not restored to the public record for decades. She did not, in the end, recover fully from her illness through the talking cure. The record on this is complicated, and the full story is not a tidy one. But what she and Breuer discovered in those sessions, the basic observation that putting a buried thing into words could move it, could change its weight in the body, that observation was the seed. Bertha Pappenheim lived on. She became, in time, a social worker, an advocate for women and for children, a figure of considerable importance in the history of Jewish women's activism in Germany. She carried a great deal further than the designation patient would suggest. The name Anna O. carried in a different direction. It carried into the paper that Freud and Breuer published together in 1895, Studies on Hysteria, Studien über History. The argument was careful and, for its time, quite radical. hysterical symptoms, the paralyses, the unexplained pains, the gaps and disturbances that seemed to have no physical lesion behind them were not random. They were not simple malingering, not women performing illness for attention, not moral weakness. They were, Freud and Breuer proposed, the residue of something forgotten. A traumatic memory, or something in the neighborhood of a traumatic memory, that had been shut away before it could be properly processed, before the feelings attached to it could be fully experienced and then released. The feeling had not gone. It had gone underground. And underground it continued to press, and the pressure found its way out through the body, through a symptom, a pain, a paralysis, a disturbance. To say this is to say something that sounds now nearly obvious. You will have heard versions of it from people who have never read a page of Freud. The body keeps the score, some say. What we cannot feel, we store. The language has changed, but the observation has entered the common water. In 1895 it was startling. Symptoms had causes, and the causes were emotional, and the emotions could be reached by talking. The treatment that followed from this was still, at first, hypnosis. The patient was put into a trance, and in the trance encouraged to find the original moment, the first occurrence of the feeling, and speak it fully, and in speaking it fully, discharge the feeling that had never been discharged. Freud had learned this from Charcot, refined it with Breuer, tried it on his own patients. But he was not satisfied with it. Hypnosis required the patient to be hypnotizable, and not everyone was. More than that, it felt to him like a shortcut that bypassed something. When you put a person in a trance and led them to a memory, who was really doing the remembering? How much of what came up was real, and how much was shaped by the suggestion of the clinician? He was suspicious of the method the way a careful craftsman is suspicious of a tool that does part of the job for you, the part you cannot see. He began, gradually, to do without it. What he found, as he worked without hypnosis, was that patients could reach buried material by another route. He would have them lie down, the divan, the Persian rug, the cushions, and he would sit out of sight, and he would give them an instruction. Say whatever comes to mind, whatever arises, without editing, without deciding it is too trivial or too shameful or too strange. Everything. The fragment of a memory, the odd image, the name that floated up from nowhere, the thing that seemed completely unrelated to anything. Everything comes out. Nothing gets held back. This was the fundamental rule. The rule that has no exception. It was also, as any patient who has actually tried it will tell you, one of the hardest instructions ever given. We are trained, from childhood, to select, to make sense, to present ourselves in a coherent light, to not say the strange thing that just crossed your mind because it is embarrassing or seems ridiculous. The fundamental rule asks you to stop doing all of that, to let the mind go where it goes and say what it finds, out loud, to another person sitting behind you where you cannot see his face. Free association. That is what Freud eventually called it. An inadequate name, maybe, because the associations are not free in any ordinary sense. They are constrained by exactly the pressures and repressions and buried things that the method is trying to uncover. The very places where the free association stumbles and halts and produces a sudden blank, those are often, Freud believed, the most interesting places. The silence, the hesitation, the "I don't know why I thought of that," these are the fault lines. The places where the old pressure is greatest, where the buried material is closest to the surface. He would sit, he would listen, he would say very little, and sometimes Not always, not quickly, not easily. Something came up. He was building the method as he went. He was also watching his own mind, sitting behind those patients, noticing what moved in him when he heard certain things, noticing how a patient could begin to feel about him, trust him, depend on him, or push against him in ways that seemed attached not quite to him personally, but to some figure from earlier in the patient's life. A father, a teacher, an older woman who had once either protected or failed the patient in some defining moment. Freud saw this happening and did not dismiss it as a clinical nuisance. He gave it a name, eventually, transference. The transfer of feeling from an earlier relationship onto the analyst. And he came to think that this transfer, this displacement of old emotion onto the new relationship, was not a complication to be managed, but was, at the heart of things, what the treatment had to work with. All of this was growing, slowly, out of his consulting room, out of the hours behind the couch, out of listening. He was still a young man, by one reckoning. He was in his 30s, his 40s. He was working very hard. He was taking notes. He was smoking the cigars, already by this point, prodigiously, the 24 a day or close to it that would mark his whole adult life. The smell and the ritual of them, something he said, was inseparable from his capacity to think. And he was waiting for his father to die. Take a slow breath. The story is going to go somewhere harder now, and more important. Jacob Freud was old. He had been the wool merchant, the wanderer, the gentle man on whose third marriage the whole family had been built. He was not a dominant figure in the way a patriarch might be expected to be. He was easy and somewhat mild, and Freud had complicated feelings about him. Admiration mixed with something that was at times impatience. Affection tangled with the particular frustration a fiercely ambitious son can feel toward a father who did not dominate the world, who had not arrived at the top of anything, who had simply gotten through. Jacob Freud died in 1896, and Freud felt something he had not predicted and could not quite name. Or rather, he felt too many things at once. The way grief tends to arrive, not as a single note, but as a chord, and some of the notes in that chord are ones you are ashamed to be playing. Relief can be in there. Guilt for the relief. An anger at the person for leaving. An anger at yourself for the anger. Old wounds reopening alongside the fresh one. All of it arriving at the same moment. He began to dream. He had been noticing his dreams before his father died, the way a scientist notices anything that passes regularly before him. But after the death, the dreams came with particular intensity and with what seemed to him a particular significance, and he began to write them down. Not casually. Systematically, he applied to his own nights the same careful attention he had been applying to his patients in the chair. He treated himself as a subject. He called it a self-analysis. There was no one he could go to for the work he had been doing with his patients. No analyst in that sense existed yet. He was, in a way, inventing the profession, and you cannot be the first person to invent a profession and then also be its patient. So he did it himself. He lay awake at night with his dreams, and he worked on them the way you work on a door that is slightly stuck, gently, persistently, trying different angles, not forcing anything, waiting, and what he found, or believed he found, astonished him. But the astonishment, and the book that came from it, and the theory that the book carried, that belongs to the next room. For now, this room. The consulting room where patients came and lay down and said whatever came to mind. The room where a young Viennese physician sat behind them, out of sight, listening in a way that no one had quite listened before. Not for what was said, but for what the saying revealed. Not for the content, but for the shape. The hesitations. The sudden floods. The names that appeared from nowhere. The images that had no obvious source. He was learning to listen to the language the mind does not know it is speaking, and the grief of his father's death was opening in him, at the same time, the first real glimpse of what lay underneath his own language. He was learning, through loss, that the instrument he was using to study other minds was itself a mind, one with its own buried rooms, its own old furniture, its own doors it preferred to keep shut. He had been, before all of this, a scientist of nerves and fish. He had become, in the years between the eel dissections and the couch and the death of Jacob Freud, something harder to name. A listener. Yes, a theorist. But also, and perhaps above all, a man turning himself inside out in order to understand what the inside looks like. The little gods on his desk kept watching. Patient, as gods tend to be, made of stone, they had been waiting in the ground for a long time before someone dug them up. They understood about patience. They understood about what survives being buried. Jacob Freud died in October 1896. He was 73 years old. He had been a wool merchant and a father and a man who kept a Hebrew Bible with an inscription inside it. He had moved his family from Freiberg to Leipzig and then to Vienna when Sigmund was 3 or 4 years old, in search of a livelihood that kept not quite arriving. He had done his best by a large and complicated household. He had loved his youngest wife and been loved in whatever way old fathers and ambitious sons love each other, with admiration and impatience and gratitude all knotted together, difficult to separate. When he died, Sigmund Freud was 40 years old. He had been practicing medicine for years. He had translated Charcot. He had sat with Breuer's patients and then his own patients. He had learned to listen to the hesitations and the floods and the images that had no obvious source. He had a wife and several children and a consulting room at Berggasse 19 and a desk beginning to fill with little gods. And the death of his father, he would later write, was the most important event, the most decisive loss in a man's life. He meant it as a general statement, but he was also speaking of himself, of what opened in him in the months that followed. He had always been, to some degree, his own subject, a scientist who could not quite leave his own mind out of the laboratory. He had analysed his moods and his friendships and his headaches with the same close, relentless attention he had once given to eel gonads and crayfish neurons. He had written long, searching letters to his friend Wilhelm Fliess, a Berlin physician, a man of enormous energy and somewhat unstable theories, who served for years as Freud's most trusted confessor, the one person he could say anything to. The letters to Fliess are almost like thinking aloud, a working through in real time. But the death of his father opened something deeper, something that did not have a clinical name yet. He began, in the months of 1896 and into 1897, what he would later call his self-analysis. Not a formal process, because there was no formal process. He was, in a sense, inventing one as he went. He began to use himself as a patient, to lie down in the mind's own consulting room, so to speak, and say whatever came to mind, however strange, however uncomfortable, however much it surprised him. And what he used as his primary material was his dreams. He had been collecting dreams for years, his own and his patients'. He kept notes. He had the scientist's instinct that nothing was random, that if a pattern appeared, in enough cases it was trying to say something, and the job of a careful observer was to learn what language it was speaking in. He had dreamed in the summer of 1895, before his father died, but in the midst of everything else, a dream that would become, for him, the cornerstone of the whole theory. He called it the dream of Irma's injection. In the dream, there was a patient. In waking life, a woman he had been treating, a friend of the family, whose treatment was not going quite as he had hoped. In the dream, he examined her, he looked into her throat and found a strange whitish substance. There were other doctors in the dream, colleagues of his, men he knew. One of them gave her an injection with an unclean syringe. The injection, the dream suggested, had caused the problem in the first place. On the face of it, strange, unsettling, the kind of dream you might note and move on from. But Freud did not move on. He sat with the dream for hours. He applied the method, free association, the patient instruction, to say whatever comes to mind, to himself, to each element of the dream in turn. The patient, the throat, the colleagues, the syringe. And what unfolded, layer by layer, was not random imagery. It was his own anxieties about his work, his professional reputation. His worry that he might have made an error with this patient, his wish to be absolved of responsibility, to have someone else be the cause of the problem. The dream he came to see was not a chaos. It was a wish, a disguised, coded wish. The mind, asleep and released from the censor of waking self-awareness, had assembled this strange theatre in order to show him what he wanted but could not, in daylight, quite admit. He was not the one who had given the faulty injection. In the dream, someone else had done it. He was cleared. The mind, Freud decided, had staged the clearing. He wrote later, and this has the quality of a man genuinely astonished by what he has found, that the house where he dreamed that dream deserved a marble plaque. He said, with the dry humour that was always threaded through his seriousness, that the plaque ought to read, "Here the secret of the dream revealed itself to Dr. Syme. Freud, he never got his plaque." But he got something else instead. He got the theory. Take a slow breath here. Set the day down, if you have not already set it down. There is nothing to figure out. Just an old story about a man who learnt to listen to the part of himself that only speaks when the lights are off. We can continue when you are ready. The theory, which he would spend the next several years writing into a book, was this: when you are awake, the mind keeps order. There is a function in it. Freud would eventually call it the censor, whose job is to manage the contents of awareness. Not everything you think, feel, or want is permitted into the light of consciousness. Some things are too painful, some are too shameful, some are too threatening to the self-image you carry through the day. These things are pushed down, repressed, in the clinical term, kept in the dark. But they do not disappear. They go on living, underneath, and at night when the censor grows drowsy, when the hold of waking logic loosens, these things begin to move. Dreams are the result of that movement. But the censor, even in sleep, does not simply stand aside and let the buried wishes march through unchallenged. It is still there, still working, but now at lower power. So the wishes come through, but in disguise. Transformed, coded. The thing the mind wants to show you has been dressed up in strange clothes, so that even while you are dreaming you do not quite recognize what you are looking at. He gave the two layers names. What you actually remember of a dream, the strange narrative, the rooms and faces and inexplicable events, he called the manifest content. That is the surface, the visible costume. Underneath it is the latent content, the actual wish, the buried meaning, the thing the dream is really about. And between the two layers there is what he called the dream work, the disguising process itself. the mechanism by which the latent content becomes the manifest content. He identified its main tools. One he called condensation, several different thoughts or feelings pressed together into a single image, a face in a dream that belongs somehow to two people at once, a house that is your childhood home and also your current office, an action that carries the weight of three different meanings at the same time. The dream packs multiple layers into a single, dense symbol. The other main tool he called displacement. The wish or the anxiety or the emotion attaches itself not to the thing it is really about, but to something nearby, something less threatening. You dream about a lost key when you are, beneath the surface, worried about something else entirely. The emotion is real. The target has been shifted. These two mechanisms, condensation and displacement, Freud saw as the primary grammar of the dreaming mind, the language of the unconscious. Compressed, associative, symbolic, following its own rules rather than the rules of daylight logic. And at the center of every dream, however strange its surface, was the thing he called wish fulfillment. The dream, he argued, is always trying to give the dreamer something the dreamer wants but cannot have in waking life, something repressed or forbidden or simply unavailable. The sleeping mind stages a private theatre in which the wish is granted, if only in symbol, if only in disguise. He called the dream the royal road to the unconscious, not a detour, not a curiosity. The main route, the place you go when you want to see what is actually running underneath the surface. He wrote all of this down. It took years. The writing was slow and difficult, interrupted by patients and children and his own recurring self-doubt. He worried that the ideas were too strange, too far from the respectability of the neurology he had started with. He wrote to Fliess that he did not know if the book was any good. He called the finished book Die Traumdeutung. In English, The Interpretation of Dreams. He sent it to the publisher in the autumn of 1899, the publisher hoping to attach it to the grandeur of a new century, post-dated the title page to 1900. It went out into the world carrying a year it had not quite been born in, a small, characteristic irony. And the world did not notice. In its first years, The Interpretation of Dreams sold only a few hundred copies. Scholars who reviewed it were mostly polite and mostly puzzled. The scientific establishment regarded it as interesting and unverifiable. The general public did not yet know there was anything to read. The book sat on the shelf. It waited. Here is the thing about that silence that has always struck me as worth sitting with. The most influential account of the human mind ever written, a book that would change how a whole civilization thought about itself, that would put the word unconscious into the everyday speech of people who had never read a word of psychology. That book was, for years, simply ignored. Not denounced, not burned, just quietly unread, gathering dust in its first printing, while the man who wrote it went back to his patients and his desk and his cigars and kept working. It would take nearly a decade for the book to be reprinted. By then, things would have changed. But that is a little further in the story. Quick reminder, and I mention this because it genuinely helped, after years of lying awake with a mind that would not settle, deep sleep finally became something real and regular. Learning came easier after that. Energy returned. The mind started holding on to things that used to slip away. If you want the exact approach that made the difference, it is in the pinned comments. The years after the dream book were not quiet years, whatever the market for books might have suggested. Freud was thinking. He was always thinking. And the thinking was spreading outward from the dream. from that one strange specimen, the dream of Irma's injection, that had cracked the theory open into other territories, other ordinary, seemingly insignificant events of daily life. He had noticed something in himself and in his patients, not just the dramatic hysteria, the paralyzed arm, the patient who could not speak, but smaller things, quieter things, the name you cannot retrieve when you need it, though you know perfectly well that you know it, the object you are certain you put down and cannot find, the word that comes out wrong, not the word you meant, but a different word, sometimes an embarrassing one, sometimes one that seems to say something you did not intend to say. He called these parapraxes. It comes from the Greek para, beside, praxis, action, beside the action. A slip. The world would call them Freudian slips. His argument, laid out in the Psychopathology of Everyday Life in 1901, was deceptively simple. These slips, these forgettings, these mislayings and misspoken words, they are not random. They are not mechanical failures in an otherwise reliable system. They are meaningful. The same unconscious machinery that disguises wishes in dreams and hides feelings beneath symptoms is running, quietly, all the time. And when it slips through the surface of polite, orderly waking life, it shows you something. The name you forget is not a name your mind has mislaid. It is a name your mind preferred not to bring forward. The word that came out wrong is, sometimes, the word that was truer. He gave examples. A man who introduced a guest of honor at a dinner by declaring the meeting adjourned instead of open. Because, Freud suggested, some part of him did not want the meeting to happen at all. Small things, the kind of things you would ordinarily explain away as tiredness, as distraction, as nothing. Freud said, look more carefully at the nothing. And this, more than the dream book, more than the clinical theory, is what made psychoanalysis a popular phenomenon. Not because the general public read studies on hysteria or worked through the elaborate mechanics of dream work, but because suddenly there was an idea you could hold in your hand in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. The idea that the small, unintended moments of daily life were not accidental at all, that the mind was always speaking even when you were not listening, that there was something underneath the surface of yourself, and it occasionally said things in public. The phrase Freudian slip entered the language and stayed there. It is still there. Whatever the scientists and the philosophers would later argue about whether Freud's methods were rigorous enough, whether his cases proved what he claimed they proved, the phrase remained. The idea remained. The ordinary person, who would not be able to tell you anything about transference or condensation, knows what a Freudian slip is. That is a remarkable kind of longevity for a clinical concept. Let us rest here for a moment. Take a slow breath. Notice, if you will, the quiet around you, the weight of your own body, wherever it is. There is nothing you need to figure out or remember. Just listening. When you are ready, we can continue. By 1905, Freud was publishing in 3 different directions at once. He published his study of jokes and their relation to the unconscious, in which he argued, with characteristic thoroughness, that the laugh is another kind of safety valve. That humour, like dreaming and like slipping, is one of the ways the forbidden gets a moment of fresh air. We laugh, he thought, because the joke gives us brief permission to enjoy what we normally have to suppress. The laughter is the release. But the publication that reached widest into the culture and caused the most alarm was a different book entirely. He called it 3 Essays on the Theory of Sexuality. The title alone was enough, in 1905, to make polite Viennese society recoil. Sexuality was not, in that world, a subject that respectable physicians addressed in full-length theoretical works. It was something managed privately, something discussed in low voices at most, something that respectable science preferred to leave at the margins. Freud put it at the center. His argument went like this: sexuality does not begin in adolescence. It does not arrive, fully formed, with physical maturity and the relevant social pressures. It begins in infancy. It begins, in fact, at the beginning. The infant is a creature of diffuse, generalized pleasure. Any part of the body can serve as a source of satisfaction, and the capacity for that satisfaction is present from the earliest weeks of life. What happens over time is that this diffuse pleasure becomes organized, channeled, shaped by experience and development into something recognizable. He proposed that this development moves through stages. The first he called the oral stage. The infant's world is organized, above all, around the mouth. Feeding, sucking, the lips and tongue as the primary instruments of encounter with the world. Then the organizing center shifts through a second stage and into a third, which he called the phallic, in which the child becomes aware, with the new consciousness that comes in the middle years of childhood, of the body's own structure and of the structures of others. And it is in this third stage, roughly between 3 and 6 years old, that he placed the drama he considered the most foundational of all, the drama he named after a Greek tragedy. Sophocles wrote it. A king who kills his father and marries his mother, not knowing who they are, not knowing what he is doing. And when the terrible knowledge arrives, the horror is in the recognition that the thing he has done, he did without knowing he was doing it. The crime was unconscious. The impulse was there, underneath, running its program in the dark, while the man's waking self carried on believing himself innocent. Freud saw in this story not a horror, but a mirror. He argued that the child, in this stage, develops a version of this drama, not in the literal, enacted sense, obviously, but in the underground emotional sense. A wish, unconscious, toward the parent of the opposite sex. A rivalry, unconscious, with the parent of the same sex. A tangle of desire and guilt and fear running beneath the orderly surface of family life, doing its work before language has quite arrived to describe it. He called it the Oedipus complex, and the term, like the Freudian slip, survived the counterpart term for the version of the drama as it plays out in girls he called the Electra complex. But it is worth noting, with the care this story deserves, that the term Electra complex was not Freud's. It was coined by Carl Jung, who was at this point still within the movement and who would not remain there much longer. Freud himself was skeptical of the mirror symmetry implied by a separate female name, and the theoretical account of female development was, frankly, one of the weaker rooms in the whole architecture, contested hard by women analysts and feminist critics, and not without reason. These are things worth knowing when you hear someone summarize Freud as a man who had everything figured out. He did not have everything figured out. Some of what he had figured out was genuinely powerful and lasting. Some of it was wrong or incomplete or shaped by the blind spots of his time and place. The fairest way to look at him is to hold both of those things at once. And there is one matter that deserves particular care, because it has been argued about ever since. In the early years of his clinical work, the period when he and Breuer were first developing the theory that hysterical symptoms are the residue of forgotten trauma, Freud heard from many of his female patients accounts of childhood sexual abuse. He published a theory, which he called the seduction theory, that this early abuse was the cause of neurosis in adult life. Then, in 1897, he reversed himself. He wrote to Fliess that he had come to doubt these accounts. Not that he was calling his patients liars, but he had begun to think that at least some of what they described as real events might be, in fact, unconscious fantasies, wishes, in the language of the theory, rather than memories of actual events. He substituted, in place of the seduction theory, the idea of infantile sexuality and the Oedipal drama. The fantasies were real and formative, but they were, in his new reading, internal productions of the developing mind rather than necessarily records of external events. This reversal has never stopped being argued about. Geoffrey Masson, among others, mounted a serious historical critique decades later, arguing that Freud abandoned a true and important finding under social and professional pressure, that the abuse was real and that calling it fantasy served to protect perpetrators and silence victims. Others argue that the picture is more complex, that Freud was grappling with genuine ambiguity, that he never denied all real abuse, and that the fantasy life of childhood is both real and clinically significant regardless of that debate. I am not able to settle that argument here, at this hour, and I would not want to pretend otherwise. What I can say is that it is a genuine argument, not a closed question, that it touches something important about how we listen to accounts of harm, and that it is one of the places where the biography of the man and the politics of the theory become impossible to fully separate. For now, let us simply note that the reversal happened, that it was consequential, and that it has not stopped being examined. Take a slow breath. Notice that there is nothing required of you tonight, only listening. The old arguments will still be there in the morning. They have been there a long time. Among all the things Freud wrote, it is the case histories that read most like literature. He himself acknowledged it, he noted, with some evident wryness, that his case histories read more like short stories than like the scientific papers they were supposed to be. He could write. He was a gifted writer in German, perhaps one of the finest prose stylists in German of his generation, and when the Goethe Prize was given to him in 1930, the committee was recognizing something real. The cases he chose to write about were not chosen at random. They were chosen because they dramatized the theory. Each case was, in a sense, a proof by story. There was the patient he called Dora. Her real name was Ida Bauer. She was 18 years old when she came to Freud in 1900, referred by her father, suffering from what appeared to be hysteria, difficulty breathing, a nervous cough, episodes of loss of voice, depression. She was intelligent, articulate, and deeply unhappy in circumstances that Freud himself described as genuinely difficult. Her father was having an affair with the wife of a family friend. That family friend, a man Freud called Herké, had made sexual advances to Dora when she was 14, when he kissed her suddenly in his place of business, and later when she was 16 on the shore of a lake. Dora told her parents what had happened. Her father did not believe her, or chose not to believe her, because acknowledging it would have complicated the arrangement that suited him. She came to Freud in some sense because there was nowhere else to go. The treatment lasted 11 weeks. Dora stopped it herself, abruptly, before Freud considered it complete. He wrote up the case years later, in 1905, publishing it in a form that revealed his own reading of what her symptoms meant, what her dreams revealed, what the hidden wishes underneath the distress were about. Feminist critics, beginning decades later, read the case very differently. They pointed out that Freud spent considerable theoretical energy on what Dora was unconsciously wanting, and rather less on what was being done to her by the men around her. That the question of what this young woman's mind secretly desired was perhaps not the only, or even the primary, question her situation raised. The case of Dora is one of the places where the theory and its limitations appear in the same frame. It is not a triumphant illustration. It is something more complicated and more honest. A case where the method revealed something real and missed something also real, and where the man who built the method was not above being a man of his time. Then there was the Rat Man. His real name was Ernst Lanzer. He came to Freud in 1907, suffering from obsessional neurosis, a form of mental anguish in which the mind produces terrible thoughts that the person cannot stop, that seem alien to everything they believe themselves to be, and that appear again and again, however desperately they try to suppress them. The Ratman's obsessions centered on a fear, elaborately imagined, unbearable, involving rats and the punishment his loved ones might suffer. He was an educated, sensitive young man, capable of clear reasoning about everything except the obsession itself. That was precisely the clinical picture, a highly intelligent person held hostage by something operating below the reach of intelligence. Freud listened to him for about a year. The treatment, he said, was among the most successful he had conducted. Lanzer's symptoms eased substantially. He would die in the First World War, years later, which Freud recorded with evident sorrow. The Wolfman. His real name was Sergei Pankajev. He was a young Russian aristocrat when he came to Freud in 1910, suffering from severe depression and debilitating inhibitions. He had had a dream in childhood, the dream that gave him his pseudonym, in which white wolves sat in a walnut tree outside his window, staring at him in utter stillness. The dream, and the terror it carried, had stayed with him. Freud spent years with him, longer than almost any other patient, and published the case in 1918. The analysis of the wolf dream was long and intricate, turning on Freud's attempt to locate a specific scene from early infancy, what he called a primal scene, that he believed was encoded in the dream. Whether he found it, or whether he constructed it, became a question Pankajev himself raised in interviews he gave, decades later, in his very old age. He lived to nearly 90 and was never quite sure what the analysis had given him. He was, at the end, still carrying something. And then, the smallest of the famous cases, and in some ways the most affecting. Little Hans. His real name was Herbert Graf. He was the young son of a follower of Freud, a man who dutifully recorded his son's behavior and correspondence, and reported everything back to the doctor. Hans was 4 or 5 years old. He had developed a phobia of horses, a terror, specific and inexplicable, that he might be bitten by one. In Vienna in 1909, horses were everywhere. They pulled the carts and the carriages through the streets. This made the phobia exhausting to live with. Freud met the child only once in person. The treatment was conducted largely through the father, who was the intermediary. And what Freud built from the letters and records was an account of the phobia as a displaced anxiety, a fear that really belonged somewhere else, but had, through the same mechanisms at work in dreams, attached itself to horses. The horse as a stand-in for the father. The fear of being bitten as a transformed version of the child's anxious ambivalence toward the large, powerful, unpredictable authority figure at the center of family life. Little Hans, Herbert Graf, grew up to become an opera director. He was asked, late in his life, what he remembered of the analysis and of Freud. He said he remembered very little. He seemed, by his own account, to have come through the phobia and gone on to live a reasonably full and interesting life. Whether the analysis caused that, or whether the phobia would have lifted on its own, as childhood phobias sometimes do, that he could not say, and neither, honestly, can anyone. The cases are stories. That is both their power and their limitation. They persuade the way stories persuade, through the felt sense of recognition, through the coherence of a narrative that makes disorder comprehensible. They do not prove the theory in the way that a controlled experiment proves a hypothesis. Freud knew this. His critics knew it. But sit with them for a moment. Dora, who stopped the treatment and walked out. The rat man, who died in the war. Sergei Pankajev, who in old age said he was still not sure what had been done to him. Little Hans, who remembered nothing and became a man who staged operas. These were people. Before they were case studies, before they were evidence, before they were names in a textbook, they were people who came into a room and lay down on a couch and talked. And someone sat behind them and listened. The listening was the whole of it. Whatever else was right or wrong or contested about the theory, there was that. A room. A quiet. Someone attending, without judgment, to the things that are hardest to say. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Notice what has settled in you, in the quiet. When you are ready, we can continue together. The consulting room at Burgas 19 was, by the early years of the new century, a well-known room, not celebrated yet, not famous, but known in the circles where it mattered as the place where something new was being done. And around the work, around Freud himself, his cigars and his couch and his desk crowded with little gods, a community was beginning to form. In 1902, a small group began to meet on Wednesday evenings. They gathered in Freud's waiting room, that anteroom to the consulting room, the threshold between the ordinary world and the world of the treatment. They sat in a circle. They discussed cases and ideas and the growing body of work. An urn passed around the circle, and whoever drew the slip of paper with their name spoke first about the topic of the evening. The group was small at first. Alfred Adler was there, a man who was then a loyal member and who would later develop his own competing psychology, emphasizing the role of power and the sense of inferiority over the sexuality that Freud placed at the center of everything. Wilhelm Steckel was there, a man of quick and vivid intuitions who could produce ideas at great speed, not all of them careful. Otto Rank, who was younger and who became something like a proc, an intimate member of the inner circle for many years. Others joined over time. The circle grew and changed. They called themselves the Wednesday Psychological Society. In 1908, when the group had grown and the movement had become something larger than a gathering of friends, they renamed themselves the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. The name mattered. It was a declaration: this is not just an informal reading group, this is a discipline, a field, a thing with its own rules and its own body of knowledge and its own institutional presence. Freud was the center of all of it. There is no other way to describe it. He was the founding intelligence, the arbiter of what belonged to the theory and what did not, the person whose approval mattered and whose disapproval stung. He was warm to those who were loyal and cold to those who departed. He had the instincts of a founder, the confidence, the territorial intelligence, the deep conviction that what he had built was worth defending. And in the room where all of this happened, the waiting room turned meeting room, the consulting room where the cases accumulated, there was always the smell of his cigars. He smoked roughly 20 a day. By his own account, and by the account of everyone who knew him, the cigars were not incidental. They were part of how he thought. He said he needed them to work. He said the ritual of the cigar was bound up with his capacity for concentration, for the long, sustained attention that the theoretical work required. He had begun smoking seriously in his young adulthood and had not stopped. He was warned. He knew the warnings existed. He did not give up the cigars. There is a line attributed to him, one of the most famous lines attributed to him, about cigars. You have probably heard it. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. It is charming. It is the perfect Freudian joke, the founder winking at his own system. But the line has no verified source. It does not appear in his published writings. It does not appear in the letters that have been carefully examined. It is, almost certainly, a piece of folklore, the kind of saying that attaches itself to a figure because it feels right, because it captures something about how we want the person to have been. Leave it in the category of probably not. Charming, but unverified. What was verified was the dog. Freud kept a chow. Her name was Jofi. She attended sessions. She lay in the consulting room while patients spoke, while the analyst listened, while the hour of concentrated attention unfolded. And Freud noticed, with the observational instincts that had never left him since the days of the eel dissections, that Jofi seemed to know when the analytic hour was drawing to its close. She would stir. She would shift. The patient, lying on the couch, talking into the quiet, would sometimes hear the dog move and begin, unconsciously, to wrap things toward an ending, as though some part of them recognized the signal even before the conscious mind had processed it. Freud claimed she also read the patient's tension, that she sat closer to the ones who were calmer and kept a little distance from the ones who were most disturbed. Whether this was the dog's sensitivity or Freud's own warm attribution to an animal he clearly loved, it is difficult to say. Both seem possible, they are not mutually exclusive. But the image is real. The old man, the patient, the couch with its Persian rug, and the dog curled somewhere in the room, attending in her own way. The Wednesday evenings continued. The practice grew. The ideas were beginning to reach beyond Vienna, carried by the men who came to study with Freud, and then returned to their own cities and their own patients, carrying the method with them. Something that had begun in a waiting room and a pile of handwritten notes was becoming, slowly and with great difficulty, something that could be recognized across borders. Above the desk, where the little gods watched with their ancient stone patience, a man who had begun as a neuroscientist, who had spent his youth looking for the gonads of eels, who had followed cocaine into the body and come out the other side of that particular door with a friend's addiction on his conscience. That man was now something no medical school had prepared him to be, a cartographer of the invisible, a map-maker of the rooms the mind keeps locked. The map was not finished. It would never be quite finished. There were revisions ahead, large ones, structural ones, the kind that changed not just a detail, but the whole underlying model. There were discoveries ahead that he had not yet arrived at, and losses ahead that would cost him more than professional disappointment. But for now, on these Wednesday evenings, in the waiting room that smelled of cigar smoke and argument and the particular intensity of people who believe they are working at the edge of something new, for now, it was enough. The little community at Berggasse 19 kept meeting, kept arguing, kept building, and Freud kept smoking. In the summer of 1909, Sigmund Freud did something he almost never did. He left Europe. He had been invited by a psychologist named G. Stanley Hall, the president of Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, to deliver a series of lectures and to receive an honorary degree. It was one of the very few formal academic honors that would ever come his way. The Nobel Prize, for which he was nominated more than once, never arrived. Clark University did. And so Freud, who was 53 and had barely stepped outside Austria in years, boarded a ship and crossed the Atlantic. He brought Carl Jung with him, and Sndor Ferenczi. The three of them walked the decks together in the mornings, and Freud analysed their dreams in the afternoons, which must have made for a particular kind of ocean voyage. They arrived in New York. They visited, among other things, a place called Coney Island, which Freud apparently found bewildering. Then they made their way to Worcester, and Freud stood before an American academic audience and talked about psychoanalysis. There is a story told about that crossing, a very famous story. The version most often repeated has Freud standing at the rail as the ship sailed into New York harbor, turning to Jung and saying something to the effect that they were bringing the plague to America, and that America did not yet know it. It is a wonderful line, dramatic and faintly menacing, and entirely in keeping with the mythology of a man who believed he was carrying an uncomfortable truth into a comfortable world. But Grandpa has to be honest with you. That story rests on a single, second-hand account recorded years later, and the chain of retelling that preserved it is not short. It may be something Freud said. It may be something that was sharpened and improved with each telling, the way good lines tend to be. It may be substantially embellished. We don't know. So let us enjoy it for what it almost certainly is, a piece of folklore that captures the spirit of the man, even if we cannot be certain it captures the exact words. What we do know is what actually happened at Clark University. Freud gave 5 lectures. He spoke without notes. He received his honorary doctorate, and he said later that this recognition, this formal acknowledgement, from a university an ocean away, meant a great deal to him. Vienna had been cool toward him for years, sometimes cold, sometimes openly hostile. The American audience listened. They applauded. He was not used to that. He never returned to America. It was his only visit. But something of what he said in Worcester spread, carried in the minds of the people who heard him, and carried further still by the men who had studied with him and who were now practicing in a dozen different cities. The movement was growing, and with growth came the thing that growth almost always brings. Fracture. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way family estrangements happen, through accumulation, through small divergences that turn out not to be so small, through the slow discovery that two people who believed they agreed on the important things actually disagreed at the root. Alfred Adler was the first to go. In 1911, Adler had been part of the Wednesday group almost from its beginning, a sharp and independent thinker who had come to believe that the central human drive was not sexual, not libido in Freud's sense, but the drive for power, the wish to overcome a feeling of inferiority. He thought the body and the social world mattered more than the hidden sexual past. Freud thought this was a deflection, a softening of the hard truth. The split was formal, and by all accounts painful. Adler left and eventually built his own school, what he called individual psychology, and went on to have a substantial following of his own. The two men never reconciled. Wilhelm Steckel followed not long after, and each departure was felt. But the one that cost Freud the most, the one that seemed to shake him in a way the others did not, was Carl Jung. Jung had been, for several years, what Freud openly called his crown prince, his chosen successor, the man who would, when the time came, carry the movement forward. Freud had named him the first president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. He had written to Jung with a warmth and an openness that he showed very few people. He had invested in Jung, emotionally, intellectually, strategically, in ways that went well beyond the collegial. And Jung was extraordinary, immensely gifted, charismatic and wide-ranging, drawn to mythology and religion and the collective symbols that recur across cultures in ways Freud found interesting, but not, to his mind, properly scientific. The trouble between them built slowly. It had to do with sexuality. Freud insisted, and this was not negotiable, not for him, that the libido, the life energy, was fundamentally sexual in its nature. Jung disagreed. He thought libido was a broader psychic energy that could not be reduced to sex. He thought Freud was too narrow, too insistent on one particular origin story for the whole of the human interior. They argued. They corresponded at length, the letters growing more strained. And then, in 1913 and 1914, it ended. Jung resigned. The break was bitter. The letters stopped. What is documented, and what Grandpa finds quietly remarkable, is that during the worst of the tensions with Jung, Freud fainted. Twice, in Jung's presence. Once at a meal in 1909, once at a conference in 1912. Freud himself tried to interpret his own fainting, he wondered in letters, whether it had something to do with the place, or with his health, or with some buried meaning his conscious mind was not yet willing to look at directly. He did not come to a settled conclusion. The man who had made a science of reading the hidden signals of the body found that his own body, in the presence of the man he was losing, did something he could not explain. He lost Jung. He never fully recovered the closeness they had shared with anyone. He spoke of it in terms that were unmistakably personal. And yet, and this is the thing, he did not retreat. He organized. Ernest Jones, the Welsh physician who would eventually become Freud's most thorough biographer, proposed in 1912 that a small inner circle be formed. A committee. A ring of men whose loyalty to the work was deep enough that they could be trusted to protect it, to catch misrepresentations, to manage the movement's direction, to hold the line when others drifted or departed. Freud loved the idea, and he made it concrete in the way that was most characteristic of him. He gave each member of the committee an antique Greek intaglio gem, a small carved stone. The kind that had been pressed into warm wax to seal letters 2,000 years ago, among the very type of objects that crowded his desk and shelves. Each gem was set into a gold ring. Ernest Jones received one. Carl Abraham received one. Hans Sachs, Otto Rank, Max Eitingon, Snorre Ferenczi. 7 men, 7 rings, each carrying a small carved figure from the ancient world, a fraternity guarding an idea. Wearing on their fingers the same civilization whose buried objects filled Freud's study. He was not given to sentiment, or said he was not. But the rings suggest something else, something about needing to mark belonging, about wanting, after so many departures, to bind the remaining ones close in a way that had physical weight. The little gods on the desk watched. The rings were worn. And the work continued. Take a slow breath. Let yourself settle a little deeper into wherever you are. We are moving now into the later part of a long life, the part where the ideas grow both more ambitious and more shadowed, where the man begins to pay the price of his habits, and where the world grows darker around him in ways no amount of theory could have predicted or prevented. When you are ready, we will continue together. Quick reminder, after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. The First World War ended in 1918 and left Europe with something that did not have a proper name yet. Soldiers returning from the trenches of France and Belgium, men who had seen things that no previous century had quite prepared the vocabulary of medicine to describe, were arriving home carrying wounds that were not on their bodies. They could not stop dreaming the same terrible dream. They could not stop their hands from shaking at sounds that others did not find alarming. They were reliving, without wanting to, what their minds and bodies had survived. The clinical word at the time was shell shock. The phenomenon was not well understood. Freud had a theory about pleasure. He called it the pleasure principle. The mind, he argued, seeks pleasure and avoids pain. That is the basic economy of the unconscious. Everything the id wants is aimed at satisfying that drive. The ego mediates, negotiates with reality, defers when it must. But the underlying pull is always toward pleasure, away from pain. The returning soldiers disturbed this theory. They were not seeking pleasure in their nightmares. No one seeks to redream the worst thing that ever happened to them. They were being drawn back compulsively against any conceivable wish of their own into the experience they most wanted to escape. And they kept going back, night after night, memory after memory, as if something in them was trying, uselessly and repeatedly, to master what had already destroyed them. Freud called this the repetition compulsion, the pull to reenact what was painful. And to account for it, to account for what he was seeing in the traumatized soldiers, to account for the self-defeating patterns he had watched in decades of patients, to account, perhaps, for things he recognized in himself, he reached beyond the pleasure principle. In 1920 he published Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and in it he proposed something that even many of his own followers found difficult to accept, that alongside the life drive, alongside eros, the pull toward love and pleasure and connection and growth, there was another force, a drive toward dissolution, a pull as deep in the organism as any other toward the undoing of tension, toward rest. Toward, in the most absolute sense, stillness. He called it the death drive. Others would later call it thanatos, the Greek personification of death, though Freud himself used that label sparingly. Eros and the death drive, the two great tides pulling through every life, the urge to connect and create and go on living, and the countering pull toward the end of all striving. He did not mean that people consciously want to die. He meant something subtler and stranger, that something in the organism tends, left entirely to itself, toward the lowering of all excitation, all tension, all the costly work of being alive and wanting and building. The idea remains controversial. Many psychoanalysts after Freud have rejected it, or quietly set it aside. But it is there, in the work, born out of the wreckage of a war that had killed millions and sent others home to dream their deaths over and over again. 3 years later, in 1923, Freud published The Ego and the Id. And in it he did something that sounds simple when you state it, but took decades of clinical work and self-excavation to arrive at. He drew a new map. He had always worked with a picture of the mind divided into layers, the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. Think of it as floors in a building. The top floor is what you know you are thinking. The middle floor is what you could bring to mind if you tried. The basement is what the mind has locked away and will not, without great effort, return to you. This was his topographical model, and it served him for years. But the clinical work kept showing him things that did not fit neatly on those floors. He had patients whose guilt and self-punishment were entirely unconscious. They suffered without knowing why, punished themselves without knowing what they were punishing themselves for. Where did guilt live in the old map? It was not simply on the conscious floor, because they could not see it. And it was not quite the same as the repressed wishes in the basement either. It was something else. A third thing. And so he revised. He drew 3 new structures, not floors in a building exactly, more like 3 forces that operate simultaneously in constant negotiation. The id, the oldest, deepest part of the psyche, entirely unconscious. It does not know time, does not know reality, does not know no. It knows only what it wants and wants it now. It is the unmodified drive, the hunger before table manners, the desire before it has learned what is possible or permissible. Freud sometimes imagined it as a wild horse and the ego as its rider, though he noted that the rider is often in a more precarious position than a rider ought to be, more often going where the horse decides than directing it. The ego, the part of you that navigates reality, the part that mediates between what the id demands and what the world will actually allow. It runs on what Freud called the reality principle, not what do I want, but what can I actually do, given what is out there. The ego is where most of what you think of as you lives, your decisions, your reasoning, your sense of who you are in the world. But the ego is not, he insisted, the master of the house. It is more like a minister who believes he is running the country, while forces much larger than him determine the weather. The superego, the internalized voice of authority, your parents' expectations, your culture's rules, the judge inside you that tells you what you should be and measures, often mercilessly, how far short of it you fall. The superego is not quite conscience in the simple moral sense. It can be irrational, excessive, punishing in ways that have no proportion to any actual wrongdoing. It is the part that makes people feel guilty for things they cannot name, ashamed for desires they never acted on. It operates largely below awareness too. Id, ego, superego, 3 forces that negotiate, conflict, and occasionally reach a kind of uneasy truce that we experience as being reasonably well. And the goal of analysis, Freud stated it in a sentence that has stayed clean and clear across 100 years. Where id was, there ego shall be. Take back some of the territory from the unconscious. Let the rider know, at least a little better, what the horse is actually doing. The aim is not to silence the id. The aim is to widen the ego, to bring more of what was hidden into the light of what can be known, and perhaps chosen. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a slow breath. Notice the quiet of wherever you are tonight. We are nearing the end of a long life's work. When you are ready, we will continue together. By 1930, Freud was 74 years old. He had built, revised, defended, and lost followers, and built again. He had been nominated for the Nobel Prize and not received it. He had received the Goethe Prize that year, an award for literature, for contribution to culture, a different kind of recognition, and perhaps, in some moods, a more appropriate one. He sat down to write one final large reckoning with civilization itself. Civilization and its discontents is not a comfortable book. It does not end well, in the sense of resolving cheerfully. Its argument is stark and, if you let it in, a little sobering. Civilization, Freud wrote, depends on the suppression of instinct. The very things that allow human beings to build cities, to write music, to make laws and trade and the whole elaborate structure of cooperative life, those things require that we give up a portion of our raw instinctual satisfaction. We agree not to take what we want. We agree to defer, to redirect, to sublimate the energy of desire into labor and art and architecture, rather than into immediate gratification. This is the deal. This is what civilization costs. And the cost is chronic. It does not end. The instincts do not go away simply because civilization asks them to. They persist, pressured underground, and what they produce, the thing we feel as the bill for the arrangement, is a kind of chronic, low-level unhappiness. A dissatisfaction. A nagging sense that something is missing, that what we wanted was not quite what we got. Not because life has failed you personally, but because civilization itself runs on a fuel that is perpetually being asked to burn itself up in socially acceptable ways, and the ember is always still there. He did not say this was a reason to abandon civilization. He did not say the instincts should be set free. He said, with the cool honesty of a very old man who had spent his whole life refusing comfortable answers, that this is the situation, that we live in the tension, that there may be no resolution, only an ongoing negotiation. Now, and this is where Grandpa wants to sit quietly for a moment and be fair. Not all of what Freud said turned out to be true, or verifiable, which is a different and in some ways more important problem. The philosopher Karl Popper argued, and argued convincingly, that psychoanalytic theory was not falsifiable, that it was constructed in such a way that no possible evidence could disprove it. If a patient agreed with an interpretation, it confirmed the theory. If a patient disagreed, the disagreement itself was interpreted as resistance, which also confirmed the theory. A theory that can accommodate any outcome is, scientifically speaking, not doing what a theory is supposed to do. It is not making a prediction that reality could prove wrong. Popper used psychoanalysis as one of his central examples of what science is not. That criticism stands. It has not been adequately answered within the tradition. There are others. The concept of penis envy, which Freud used to explain aspects of female psychology, has been criticized by feminist thinkers from the beginning, and those criticisms have substance. The seduction theory reversal, which we touched on earlier, the question of what really happened when Freud shifted away from the idea that his patients had experienced actual childhood trauma, remains genuinely disputed by scholars, some of whom find his revised account more plausible, others of whom, like Geoffrey Masson in his later work, find the revision troubling. These are real debates, and anyone who tells you they are settled is not being straight with you. And yet, the vocabulary. Consider the vocabulary. Ego, id, libido, repression, projection, denial, sublimation, transference, defense mechanism. The unconscious, the Freudian slip, the Oedipus complex, the royal road to the unconscious, the talking cure. These words did not exist in ordinary speech before Freud put them there, or if they existed, they did not mean what they mean now, did not carry the particular weight they carry now, did not sit in the middle of sentences the way they sit there today. You use several of them regularly. You hear them in conversations that have nothing to do with therapy or psychology, at dinner tables, in arguments, in the quiet interior monologue of people trying to understand why they keep doing the thing they don't want to do. He did not just influence a profession. He changed the language in which people describe themselves to themselves. That is an unusual kind of power, and it is real, whatever you conclude about the scientific status of his claims. In 1923, the same year he published The Ego and the Id, The year he gave the world its new map of the mind, Freud's doctors found a growth in his jaw, cancer of the jaw and palate. Almost certainly connected, his physicians believed, to the smoking, to the roughly 20 cigars a day he had kept up for most of his adult life, the habit he had never seriously tried to break. The thing he said was connected to his capacity for work, for concentration, for the particular kind of sustained attention that his days required. He would undergo more than 30 operations over the next 16 years. 30, the surgeries removed tissue, removed bone. At some point he was fitted with a large prosthesis, a device designed to replace what had been taken, to close the gap in his palate so that he could eat and speak. It was unwieldy. It was often painful. It made chewing difficult and talking effortful. The family found a name for it, the way families sometimes find names for the hardest things, as if naming them makes them slightly smaller. They called it the monster. He kept smoking, not because he was indifferent to what was happening in his mouth, not because he did not understand the relationship between the cigars and the cancer. He understood it. His physicians told him plainly. He made some efforts, at various points, to stop, and found that without the cigars his concentration flagged, his mood suffered, his capacity for work seemed to diminish in ways he could not accept. He was a man who had spent his life insisting that the drives run deeper than the conscious will. And here, in his own body, in his own mouth, the drive running deeper than his conscious will was the drive to smoke. He kept the monster in his mouth and the cigar in his hand and went on writing. There is something in this, in the stubbornness of it, in the terrible irony of it, that is more humanizing than any of the theories. The man who mapped the unconscious could not get free of his own. Take a slow breath here. Notice what has shifted in the body. The room is very quiet. In May 1933, in Germany, students and party members piled books into bonfires in the public squares of cities across the country. Un-German books, corrupting books. Books by Jews, by Marxists, by freethinkers, by anyone whose ideas the new government considered a threat to the national character they were building. Freud's books were among them. He was 76 years old, sitting in Vienna with his monster and his cigars and his 2,000 ancient statues, and he received the news of the burning with a remark that has been quoted ever since. He said, and this one is documented, "What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Nowadays, they are content with burning my books." The remark is sardonic and precise and carries, underneath the wit, something that is not entirely sardonic at all. Because he knew, and Vienna knew, and everyone who was paying attention knew, that the books being burned in Germany would not be the last target. That what was happening across the border was moving. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria. The Anschluss. German troops entered Vienna on March 12th. Freud had been saying for years that he would not leave Vienna. He was 81. He was dying slowly, and he knew it. Vienna was his city, not born there, but shaped there across nearly 80 years, from the child of a wool merchant who arrived around 1860 to the old man who had written the century's most controversial books in the apartment above the consulting room at Berggasse 19. He did not want to leave. On March 22, 1938, the Gestapo came to Berggasse 19. They searched the apartment. And they took Anna Freud, his youngest daughter, the one he had analysed himself, the one who had given her life to the work, who had never married, who had become in her own right one of the most important child analysts in the world. Anna was detained by the Gestapo and interrogated. She was gone all day. The family did not know what was happening or when she would return. She did return. that evening, and the family, by all accounts, resolved in the aftermath of that day that they had to leave. Whatever his feelings about Vienna, whatever his resistance to the idea of dying somewhere else, the Gestapo had walked into his home and taken his daughter. There was no longer a question. The escape required help. It required the kind of help that only certain people in 1938 were positioned to give. Princess Marie Bonaparte, the French granddaughter of Napoleon's youngest brother, who had been one of Freud's patients, had trained as an analyst and had become a close friend and devoted supporter, went to work. Ernest Jones worked from London. An American diplomat named William Bullitt, who had known Freud and was sympathetic, applied pressure through official channels. A ransom had to be paid. The Nazis called it a flight tax. It was what you paid to be allowed to leave the country with your life and some fraction of your possessions. And then, before they were permitted to go, Freud was required to sign a document, a statement, declaring that he had been treated well, that the authorities had not mistreated him, a coerced endorsement of the people who had burned his books and interrogated his daughter. He signed it. The story that follows, and Grandpa wants to be careful here, because this one belongs to the same category as the plague line, documented through family and Jones, but almost certainly sharpened in the retelling. The story goes that Freud added to the document, after the required statement, one line of his own. I can heartily recommend the Gestapo to anyone. Whether those exact words were added, and whether they were in the document itself or simply said aloud, or whether they are a story that became truer and more precise each time it was told, we cannot be certain. What we can be certain of is the spirit. The man signed what he was required to sign. And the man also, in one way or another, said what he needed to say about the people who made him sign it. In June 1938, Freud left Vienna. He was 81 years old. He had a monster in his mouth. He had cancer that was not going to get better. He was leaving the city he had lived in for nearly 80 years and would never see again. He left behind, in the city he was leaving, 4 of his elderly sisters. They could not come. The arrangements that had been made, with great difficulty and at great cost, had saved Freud and his immediate family. They had not reached his sisters. Dolphy, Marie, Pauline, Rosa, they were left in Vienna. They died in Nazi concentration camps. Freud arrived in London in June 1938 and was received warmly, celebrated even. The newspapers wrote about him. He was a famous man in England in a way that Vienna had never quite allowed him to be. He settled at 20 Maresfield Gardens in Hampstead, and the people who loved him did something remarkable. They reassembled his study. Board by board and figurine by figurine, they recreated the room he had worked in at Berggasse 19. The Persian rug couch, the desk, the 2,000 little gods. They placed it all in the new house, so that he would have, in a city he had not chosen, the room that was his. He worked there. He wrote. He completed Moses and Monotheism, a late, strange, characteristically provocative book arguing that Moses had been an Egyptian and that his monotheism was a form of repressed memory carried through generations. He sat behind the couch and took a handful of patients, because he was Freud and he was still working. He smoked when he could. The house at 20 Maresfield Gardens is now the Freud Museum, London. You can visit it. The couch is still there. By the summer of 1939, the cancer had moved beyond what could be managed. He was in continuous pain. The monster had stopped being merely inconvenient and had become, in those last months, a source of suffering that was not going to resolve. Years before, Freud had made an agreement with his physician, the man who had looked after him through the operations, who managed his care, who sat with him through the worst of what his illness demanded, a doctor named Max Schur. They had talked. Freud had been direct about what he wanted. If the time came when the suffering was unbearable and there was nothing left to do but wait, if he reached that place, he did not want to be kept going past it. He had Schur's word. In September 1939, he told Schur the time had come. He said, "You remember the agreement." He said, "Don't let me be tormented for nothing." Schur administered morphine, doses that brought relief and then unconsciousness, and then, at 3 a.m. on the 23rd of September 1939, the end of all that striving. Freud was 83 years old. He was cremated. His ashes were placed in a Greek funerary urn, one that had been given to him by Marie Bonaparte, the woman who had helped save him from Vienna. A funerary urn, from the ancient world, among the oldest of the old objects he had loved his whole life. His ashes rest at Golders Green in London, not far from the house in Hampstead where the little gods sit on their desk and the couch waits in the quiet of a room that is somehow still his. Let us pause here. Take a slow breath. Let the room be still. He began in Freiberg, in a room above a blacksmith's workshop, the firstborn son of a young mother who called him her golden boy. He spent his youth bent over a microscope, looking at the nerve cells of crayfish, at the missing gonads of eels, at the cellular architecture of brains. He swallowed cocaine and gave it to his friend, and narrowly missed a discovery that would have made him famous in an entirely different way. He sat in a Paris lecture hall and watched a French neurologist make a paralyzed woman move her arm with the power of suggestion, and something turned inside him, some understanding that the mind was not merely housed in the brain, but was itself a place, with its own geography and its own sealed rooms. He went home to Vienna. He took patients. He listened in a way that doctors of his era were not accustomed to listening, not prescribing, not diagnosing from the outside, but sitting quietly and asking the person in front of him to speak whatever came to mind, however strange or shameful, however apparently unconnected to anything that mattered. And from that listening, something grew. He found in the dreams of his grieving self a language for what the mind does at night, when the day's careful management is released and the wishes that cannot be spoken aloud put on their disguises and walk through the corridors of sleep. He called it the Royal Road, not because the journey is easy, but because it leads somewhere real. The manifest content, what you remember when you wake, is the disguise. The latent content, what the dream is actually doing, is the wish underneath. Dream work is the work of disguise, condensation, which collapses many things into one image, displacement, which moves the emotional charge from where it belongs to somewhere more acceptable. All the mechanisms by which the sleeping mind manages to say what the waking mind will not. He found in the small failures of ordinary life, the name you couldn't remember, the word you said when you meant a different word, the appointment you forgot, a grammar. A hidden grammar in which the unconscious slips into the space between intention and execution, and briefly, accidentally, speaks the truth. He called it parapraxis, the word you use when you mean the other word, the appointment you forget because some part of you did not want to keep it. These things are not mistakes. They are communications from the part of the mind that the waking self would prefer to keep quiet. He found in the relationship between patient and analyst a mirror, a surface onto which the patient projects old loves and old griefs and old impossible wishes, transferred from the people who first carried them onto this new person sitting quietly behind the couch. He called it transference. And he discovered that understanding what was being transferred and from where was sometimes the most important thing a patient could do. And in his late years, he found in civilization itself the same structure he had found in the individual, a negotiation between what the deep drives want and what the shared life requires, paid for in the coin of chronic dissatisfaction. He mined himself his whole life. That was the delta, the thing underneath everything else, not just the patient's, himself, his own dreams, his own grief, his own failures, his cocaine, his addictions, his estrangements, the fainting in Jung's presence, the cancer in his mouth that he would not let change what he put in it. He turned it all over in his hands and looked at it and tried to make something true out of it. He was wrong about things. He was wrong about things in ways that mattered, and the people who said so were right to say so. The theories that survive him best are not the most dramatic ones, not the ones most easily reduced to jokes about mothers. They are the quieter ones, that the mind hides things from itself, that what we have not looked at directly will find another way to make itself felt, that the words we say, the dreams we have, the symptoms we cannot explain, the patterns we cannot seem to stop repeating, all of these carry a meaning, and meaning can be approached even if it cannot always be dissolved. Whether or not that is science in the strict sense Popper meant, it has been, for a very large number of people, enough to make a difference. The couch is still there. The urn at Golders Green is still there. The words, ego, id, libido, the unconscious, the Freudian slip, are still there, in the mouths of people who have never read a word he wrote. He did not unlock the unconscious the way you unlock a door, with a key that fits precisely and opens cleanly. He found the door and sat in front of it for a long time, and listened to the sounds on the other side. He was not always right about what he heard, but he was the one who insisted, when no one else in his world was willing to insist, that there were sounds at all. The man who began by looking for the gonads of eels ended by looking for the hidden grammar of the human interior. Both required the same thing of him, patience, and the willingness to keep looking past what everyone else had already decided to call settled. He settled nothing. He opened rooms. And the rooms are still open. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the images of the night settle. The desk crowded with ancient gods. The Persian rug on the couch. The monster and the cigars. The daughter waiting at the Gestapo's door. The urn from a French princess, holding the ashes of a man who had begun in a room above a blacksmith's shop in a small town in Moravia, and had ended in a room reassembled by people who loved him, in a city across the sea. You do not need to remember any of it. If one thing stayed with you tonight, one image, one idea, one moment of recognition, let that be enough. The rooms are there whether or not you think about them. The mind is doing, right now, exactly what he said it does. Quietly, behind the door. In the grammar of sleep. Enough stories for one night. Off to sleep now, Grandpa says.